just as we're about to get started, is to recognize it's, as Maureen said, it's been a long 8 years, and so there are a lot of people who are not here, in the sense of not being able to be here, also in the sense of not even kind of being on this plane of existence anymore. So one thing we did want to do is I wanted to remember Dennis, so we have Dennis's newest book that comes out today, which is right here on the podium with us. So now I'm not trying to sell you the book, I'm just here, just so you know why. And then I want to take just about 20 seconds of silence just to make space for those who are in the room, but not in the room. So if you just sit with me in that space, I'd appreciate it. Now, I'm convinced that I have had the greatest committee ever in the history of dissertation committees, and you can just think of this long summary to my long project as my filibuster in an attempt to keep it from ending. But we're this close. I know, Maureen, we're going to end, and we are going to end. I cannot say enough good things about Maureen, about Dennis, and about Alexander. What an amazing group of scholars and supporters and writing coaches. There wouldn't be enough time. But lest I stall any longer, let's get started. And our story begins in the information age, a moment when different ideas from different cultures and periods in time were suddenly and unexpectedly thrown into dialogue with each other. When an information superhighway streamed knowledge of different religions, mythologies, histories, sciences, and philosophies into one accessible database, which would effectively change the world, making it suddenly smaller and yet bigger at the same time, opening new possibilities even as it challenged old ideas. And I am, of course, talking about the Library of Alexandria and the city and the intellectual culture that surrounded it in late antiquity. It was a time of intense and fruitful pluralism, but also a tense and dangerous time of clashing ideologies, when massive storms of change in the collective conscious gave lessons that carry massive implications for the postmodern world. And it was at this time that Hellenistic scholars began reassessing the value of their already ancient and cherished myths, updating their meaning and bringing them into alignment with new historical, philosophical, and scientific realities. Whereas Homer and the great poets might initially seem to clash with the wisdom of, say, Plato, for example, the allegorical perspectives that they utilized at this moment in time deliteralized these myths, and suddenly they became pregnant with metaphor and symbol that communicated universal hidden truths in narrative and image. Poets suddenly became proto-philosophers, using an even more unsubtle, and for that reason, more effective language. In this intellectual interpretive community, the Jews of Alexandria did particularly well leading up to the 2nd century. First of all, due to the significance of their contribution to Western culture and understanding ourselves as historical people in a progressive narrative. And secondly, and more importantly, as a people who already had a very long-standing practice of reinterpreting and redacting their sacred texts to bring them ever into greater alignment with later ideas and with each other. And of course, predominantly through the Alexandrian Philo the Jew, this method of interpretation is passed on to Clement of Alexandria, and through him to the then infant child of Judaism and Hellenistic culture, and that, as you all know, because you know me and you know my project, is Christianity. Arriving on the scene, and the subject of our study comes Origen of Alexandria in 180 AD, otherwise known to the world of late antiquity as Origen Adamantius. I kid you not, the man of steel was his name. He's the last of the great philosopher Christians. He's the first of the great Christian theologians. He wrote his game-changing On First Principles when he was 33, a book that rocked the Mediterranean world. I will pass around my eviscerated copy if you want to take a look, open to anything, and it's pretty amazing. He's the father of Christian exegesis, which of course is in the interpretation of sacred scripture. He's the first in a long line of Christian mystics. He was the architect of early church mythology, and for 2 centuries he was the most popular Christian teacher after the apostles themselves. He drew the blueprint for much of later church dogma that still exists, even if they kind of hid his body in the concrete foundation after he died. For Origen also followed the motto that I have no idea how to pronounce because my Greek is terrible, but it's haupo logos agi, which is follow wherever divine meaning leads. And as such, he speculated on everything from stars having sentience to reincarnation, to matter being ensouled, to the universe being God's body, to the ideas that really got him in trouble. First of all, the idea that all souls pre-existed with one God in a barely remembered state of loving bliss. And two, the idea that at the end of time, or at least the end of this time, all souls, including the devil and his fallen angels, would be transformed by divine love, that is to say, permanently rescued in the context of the Christian myth from the flames of hell. And it was, of course, for this reason that 2 centuries after his death, he was excommunicated and wiped from the history books. But this hope that Origen held is a crucial component of his contribution to Christian thought, to Western culture, and also one to Jungian thought. It's an idea that Carl Jung would later misunderstand a little bit and criticize as the summum bonum. And it's important to recognize here that Origen does not insist, for those of you familiar with the concept, that all things are good. As someone that watched his father, as well as many friends and students, be executed, as someone who's often on the run himself from the persecution of the empire and the church, Origen knew life contained much suffering. But Origen believed that everything broken would, or at least potentially could, be eventually fixed. And of course, it remains to be seen if this fixing was meant literally as an actual transmutation of substance, or he meant it as a redemption of perspective, such as when he quotes Paul saying that the last enemy to be destroyed is death, and then later goes on to say, but death is destroyed by being made no longer an enemy. The bottom line is, Origen is an unashamed optimist, even in the most troubling of circumstance. He famously suggested that Christian scripture was filled with what he called scandala, scandals and stumbling blocks, controversies and contradictions. There were events recorded that seemed to be historically impossible. Likewise, heroes contained in the scriptures, both human and divine, seemed to be morally reprehensible, which left the maturing reader troubled or scandalized because the storied actions were difficult or even impossible to justify literally, much less emulate. Origen claimed this scandalizing aspect of the sacred scriptures, and he's talking about what eventually became the Bible, or the library as it's actually translated, was its true genius. It's what made it scripture. Because when the text proved shocking and made it impossible, in his words, for the reader to take the text literally, it served to force the reader to wrestle with the text and to find a deeper meaning. He used the metaphor frequently of digging down into the text to mine a more worthy meaning of the divine author or the divine reader. So of course I'd read this and I wondered how it would affect a religion to look at its sacred text in such a manner, so I posed my research question, which was quite simply to ask if the method that Origen suggested for reading a sacred text and letting the scandal involved push one to a deeper meaning could also be used to read the storied life of the reader, him or herself, to read our own lives as if they were sacred texts. You see, and this is important, Origen theorizes that scripture has at least 3 layers of meaning, which he bases on his anthropology of the human person. Soul and text are intrinsically and structurally related. The first layer is the body of the text, which Origen considers the literal level. Now this level, he insists, was useful to the simple and the sincere. He sometimes refers to this as the historical level, and it was for this reason that chapter 3 of my dissertation focuses on Origen's use of history and historical criticism. Like the Greeks before him, Origen used scholarly refutation to move the meaning beyond the context of what he calls mere history, which would otherwise seem to depict what he calls absurd fables and silly tales. Now he chose Origen's exegesis of the narrative surrounding the Noah's Ark story early in the book of Genesis as my example, and this did not at all go in the direction I expected. While Origen is known for arguing the fantastical stories of Scripture, such as 7-day creation, are merely symbolic stories without literal meaning, when it comes to the Ark, Origen flexes his scholar muscles a little bit to argue that it possibly could have happened historically. He does this, I think, in part simply to be contrarian, and simply to keep his readers guessing, demolishing any arrogant sense of certainty regarding the reading of a sacred text or a myth. But what he does accomplish here is to show the reader the extensive amount of time it takes to engage in rhetorical and historical refutation, the critical scholarship of his day, which sought not so much to debunk the historicity of stories as to shift, again, their emphasis towards symbolic readings. Not only does he take time in building the argument, but his obvious and extensive training as a grammaticus, as a scholar of the day, and as a philosopher show through. You know, he brags a little in his writing, actually brags a lot in his writing. Likewise, we see the tools he uses, and he did have a lot of tools. He all but invented the codex, which is the book, as we know, that opens and has columns side by side, and he did this to do a comparative study of multiple translations in one volume, which was impossible in a scroll. So, as his library we look at as well was the stuff of legend. Here's the thing, when we look at him, we look at the training, the tools, the time, and even the raw talent as a thinker that Origen brought to this level of academic writing, we can only conclude that this is not the literal level that he insists is the bodily part of Scripture, in many respects not unprofitable, but capable for the improving of the sincere and simple multitudes as they receive it. So having refuted refutation, chapter 4 explores the literal level as exactly that. A reading that takes the text at its own word and concerns itself with what the text literally says, the brute materiality of the words on the page. And that phrase comes from Patricia Cox Miller, whose excellent scholarship on Origen led me to explore his assessment of a story which is notoriously reinterpreted for its scandalous depiction of a medium channeling the soul of the prophet Samuel from out of the underworld. Origen's peers and predecessors jumped through all kinds of hoops to say that the story did not depict what it seemed to, because a holy prophet could never be in the underworld, nor could a holy prophet be manipulated by magic. Origen alone cries BS on this interpretation, claiming that while you can interpret a text, you cannot rewrite it to accommodate your interpretation, nor your theory, nor your theology. You must respect the concrete reality of the words on the page. In this chapter, I was then able to channel my inner James Hillman, for Origen goes on to build a relatively robust theory of the underworld and the wisdom gained by a sojourn through it, and it was awesome stuff. I really liked that chapter. But the real takeaway here is the notion that any interpretation according to Origen, be it theological, mythological, we might even say, or depth psychological, is always secondary to the text itself. As soon as something becomes just a lesson in theology, or just a morality play, or just an anima projection, or just a Fisher King story, it has lost some of the sacred vital power contained within it. And I might add as a sidebar, I learned that Origen believes here that fundamentalism is the infancy of religious belief. It needs maturation, but you can't skip fundamentalism any more than you can skip adolescence or toddlerhood if you want to make an adult. Fundamentalism is a necessary part of religion. Not what I wanted to hear, but it did kind of open my eyes a little bit. And here's a freebie, by the way. The best cure for fundamental literalism, according to Origen, is an even more literal reading of the sacred text. That said, having asked what the text literally said for us, what it meant when it was written, Origen now asks, what does it mean for us, the readers? So we move on from the body of the text to its soul. I came then in chapter 5 to the psychological meaning of the text, at which time it started for me to get really, really exciting and probably a little bit scary for my committee. Most scholars actually skip over the psychic level of the text in Origen's three-tiered system, where there is a physical level, a psychic level, and a spiritual level. Most people want to go right from the physical to the spiritual, claiming that while Origen proposes a three-tiered interpretive model, he only employs two, that of body and spirit. I found only one scholar, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Penn Dively Loro, who took this serious enough to write an entire book about it. But even she merely relegated the psychic level to the moral of the story. What I discovered rather quickly, and only because I was already looking very hard for it, was that at the psychic level of Origen's interpretation, when he reads the soul of the text after reading the body, what he's actually reading is the text of the human soul. And all throughout his works on the scriptures, Origen teaches a great deal on the structure and journey of the soul. So I simply suggest that these writings, almost omnipresent in his exegesis, are the psychic level. To say it another way, I suggest that at this second level of biblical interpretation, Origen extracts a rudimentary psychology of religious development. The soul of the sacred text reveals the sacred textual soul's transformational journey. As the reader is reading the text more deeply, the reader herself is deepening, and vice versa. Origen explored this most vividly in his mystical masterpiece, the Commentary on the Song of Songs, and wow, what a text that is. It is amazing. He suggests in the commentary that the soul grows through three successive stages. So if you're following, we now have 3 stages inside 3 levels. Origen really likes his threes. And then he offers 3 biblical heroes, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to typify each one of the stages, as well as the 3 Solomonic wisdom books as a template for the soul's progressive development. He even goes so far as to suggest that these 3 stages of development written in the style of Solomon as the proto-philosopher, were the later inspiration for the three primary schools of Greek philosophy. So we get Ethike,